Okay. Hi guys. Thank you for coming.
Alright guys, I have a quote for you guys. If you're totally illiterate and living on $1 a day, the benefits of globalization never come to you. And this is by former President Jimmy Carter. So what does he mean by that? As you guys know, I'm Brendan Ross, and I'm going to be talking about the dark corners of globalization, the small percentage that never reap the benefits of it. The people the former president are referring to is the global south, or the bottom billion, the approximate billion people from nations spanning Central Africa to Western Asia, places like Ghana, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and you guys may know them as the third world. But that's a misnomer. It's an archaic term. That stems from the Cold War, first world being aligned with the US and its allies, the second world being aligned with the former Soviet Union, and the third world non-aligned. So when we discuss the bottom billion or the global south, we're talking about these underdeveloped nations where globalization is not really reaching them. The people of these nations are characterized by dependence on Western power, delayed modernization, and unequal distribution of wealth. That seems to be the biggest problem. But how can this be? When we think of globalization, we think of places like China, for instance, whose growth has been explosive and increasingly reaches high human development with its now open border stance on the economy. Paul Collier, a professor of economics and director of Center for the Study of African Economies at Oxford University, states that these nations are now poorer than the start of their independence during the 60s and early 70s. In the 70s, he says their per capita income rose 0.5% a year, 0.5%, guys, and declined, this is during the 70s, and in the 80s, declined 0.4%, essentially putting them back, since when they first started. And to put things in perspective, China in the 1970s was growing at 16% a year. So 0.5% compared to 16% in China. So how does something like this happen? Collier, in his 2000 book titled The Bottom Billion, if you guys ever want to read it, lists a set of dilemmas for these particular nations, named traps. These traps include landlocked with bad neighbors, like that of Zimbabwe. Nations with coastlines are able to tap into the global market with little obstacle, whereas these landlocked nations are literally at the whim of their neighbors as to whether the products reaches the global markets or not. And then there's the natural resource trap, where lack thereof can create border conflicts and a nation's search for resources. A nation can, in fact, have so many resources that there's no need to tax the citizens. They're making so much revenue if they have a lot of resources. Therefore, they may not hold their nation financially reliable, and there's less of a need for manufacturing. Because, if your nation's making so much money on resources, and as long as the citizens aren't being taxed, they're not going to care what the government does with the money. They're just like, hey, we're not being taxed. And the next conflict trap is like coups or civil wars. These nations that are in constant turmoil due to warfare. Their leader creates roots in this turmoil as well because they become so accustomed to it over a few years that they use this as an advantage. For example, the corruption. They're not held reliable during these coups. And they no longer feel they need to escape this turmoil because it's all they know. The last one is nation size. Usually the smaller the nation, the more unfamiliar businesses are with multi-corporation businesses with local conditions or customs. So they opt out for larger nations like China or India because it's a well-known culture. We all hear about China and India, whereas we don't really hear about Ethiopia or Rwanda. There's a 6% chance that these nations will escape the traps within a given year. Only 6% within a given year of ever escaping any of these traps. So what can we do with this? Collier and his leading professors, like Weatherby and the Other World, suggest we, citizens of the developed world, need to concentrate our foreign aid to those bottom billion nations. So stop giving foreign aid to places like China, India, or Southeast Asia, where they're actually able to escape it themselves eventually. Because the current foreign aid we send, it's just leading to stagnation. We send barely enough. We send just enough where the GDP growth is like I said, 4%. It's not getting them out of anything. And we're still sending foreign aid to places like China and India, which their economy is booming, and they can get themselves out of the traps. We need heightened security forces to ensure coups do not threaten already in place democracies. And we need to encourage international charters or policies to encourage good government. As we become more interconnected, it makes sense that we have governing charters to ensure the equality of all nations, and not make sure one nation who may have a bigger population or a better military picks on the smaller nations and surrounding neighbors. We need to open up to more free trade agreements and give preferential treatment to these nations that may not afford the high tariffs we impose on them in the first place. So it suffices to say these solutions speak for themselves. Higher foreign aid, heightened security, they're simple. They're simple in theory. It's just us trying to get our governments to cooperate and get our governments involved, get the developed nations more involved. And do you guys have any questions so far? Okay, that concludes my speech. Thank you.